Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be with you, Paolo, Sigmar, Kevin, wise voices from around the world. Let me start with a quote. The world is at an acute crisis for acute risk for devastating regional or global disease epidemics or pandemics that would not only cause loss of life, but upend economies and create social chaos. Those were the words of the report by the Global Preparedness Monitoring Panel that was issued in November of 2019. Nearly 2 decades before, the SARS coronavirus raged for 6 months, affected 29 countries, killed more than 700 people, was something of a wake-up call, or to be precise, should have been. In the years that followed, with H1N1, with Ebola, with MERS, among others, no less than 11 high-level panels issued 16 different reports with recommendations of how we should increase our preparedness in the new age of pandemics that we had entered. And the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board was set up by the WHO and the World Bank to monitor how prepared we were. But the brutal fact is that very few of the recommendations were acted upon, and few of the reports were read outside the circles of those already convinced. The rest, as they say, is history. If we look back at this pandemic, I would say that particular local authorities in China lost about 2 weeks when it should have been acted faster after the new virus had been detected and sequenced. And the world as a whole lost 2 months at least when it should have acted faster after the WHO in January 30th declared it, as it's called, a public health emergency of international concern, using all of the red lights available to the WHO. It was really only in April that things started to happen. Act A was set up late April, 85 days after the declaration by the WHO. It was a framework to accelerate all the efforts in providing diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines. And from its vaccine pillar came the COVAX facility that was supposed to help low and medium income countries with access to vaccine. The record since then is, I would argue, a distinctly mixed one. It's a story on the one hand of tremendous scientific success, and on the other of a rather profound political failure. The first vaccines were ready for clinical trials in under a month, with safe and effective vaccines available after a mere 307 days. That was a world record. And today there are 8 vaccines that have been given green light by the WHO. Twice as many are available in different countries. And there are now 102 vaccine candidates undergoing clinical trial. It's a tremendous success of science. But politics is another issue, and I restrict myself to the global level. There is an understanding in general terms that no one is safe until everyone is safe. As long as the pandemic rages, there remains the risk that new mutations and variations might appear, complicate the situation further, and at worst, start to roll back, unravel what has already been done. And as far as the economy is concerned, Kristalina Georgieva of the IMF has been very clear in saying that today pandemic policy is the most important economic policy. Calculations of the IMF shows that an investment of $50 billion in diagnostics, in treatments, and in vaccines would bring an improvement to the global economy in the order of $9 trillion, including, by the way, an increase in the tax income of high-income countries in the order of $1 trillion. It's real money. Few investments are as profitable as that. But in spite of that, I have to say that the outcome of the recent G7 meeting was disappointing. There were no further commitments of resources to bridge the immediate funding gaps, roughly $16 billion identified by Act A. And commitments of vaccine dose sharing fell distinctly short of what had been identified as absolutely necessary. So it's an uphill struggle for the G20. We now see that globally reported cases have been declining for 8 weeks. That's a good story. But if you look at the figures for Latin America and Africa, you see steep increases, and that is most worrying. In Europe, The so-called Delta variation that first emerged with such devastating force in India is now rapidly gaining ground. It has already been identified, by the way, in 85 countries around the world. And new variations of concern, as is the official term, could well emerge. The Lambda variation first identified in Peru might well be a candidate. And mind you, it's only 15% of the global population that has any access to vaccines overall. That's a fairly small number. And in order to bring the pandemic to an end, there is a need to vaccinate roughly 70% of the global population until next summer. That makes it necessary to have roughly 11 billion doses of vaccine available. There's an unprecedented effort underway to do this. It's a complicated one, and it's hampered by vaccine nationalists. It's hampered by quite a number of trading restrictions and export restrictions that, surprisingly enough, they've come down in number, but they are still there. And there's a need for much more in terms of diagnostics. We are flying blind in large parts of the world. And there's a need for treatment. We must not allow the oxygen crisis that we saw with such horrifying effects in India to be repeated in Asia and in Latin America. By the time of the G20 in Rome, there will be a strategic review of Act A. There are the different other panel reports. Kevin mentioned the report by the Helen Clark, the independent panel. The 100-day report of the G7. More is bound to come. But we need to focus now, I would say, on getting the resources to fight the pandemic. 85% of the world hasn't have access to any vaccine. We need to concentrate on getting the money there. It's an investment that is worth doing. And after that, start to focus on what can be done thereafter. There's a World Health Assembly special meeting coming up in November on a pandemic treaty. I think there's a lot that needs to be done at that particular time. We were not prepared this time. We must make certain that we are better prepared next time. And just remind finally that it might be that we have been very lucky this time. If the virus had been as transmissible, if there had been a virus instead of this one that had been as transmissible as COVID-19 has been, but as deadly as SARS, that could have been, as someone has said, a civilization-shattering experience. So for all of the depth of this particular crisis, perhaps this was the warning shot that we needed. And we really need to get our act together. G20 will be critical for that. We failed this time. We won't have the room to fail another time. Thanks.